Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. I won't introduce myself fully, but I'm Hugh. I'm a practitioner at PBS UK, and I'm going to talk to you about compassion, Buddhism, and PBS. The kind of starting point, I suppose, is explaining why I've chosen Buddhism as a topic. It's a big topic, so squeezing it into 45 minutes is probably a little bit ambitious. But really, I suppose it links in with the use of the term compassion within the title today. Whenever a term like this is introduced, my first concern is always what it means to different people. So what compassion means to me personally will be distinctly different to what it means to others. And often the kind of concern about things like this is that it ends up being a kind of sort of derivative, that it just means sort of being nice to people, which, you know, I've got concerns about that. Compassion is really, really important within Buddhism. It's a very specific concept and it has a specific meaning. And essentially that's why I've chosen kind of Buddhism as a key element of my topic today. So developing and maintaining a compassionate outlook is a fundamental element of Buddhism. And therefore, we're going to consider how we might define compassion through looking at a Buddhist perspective. In terms of sort of introducing myself a bit more, you know, that the previous slide is very much the dream. The reality, you know, Stephen Fry in a dress saying, "Oh Christ, I've left the iron on," is perhaps more accurate. And it kind of brings me to a couple of important points. So firstly, my background with Buddhism is very much that it's an interest rather than an area of expertise. So by no means am I saying, sort of taking a holier than thou approach, that I get this right. I really, really don't. I'm also not saying that Buddhism is best. You know, fundamentally, particularly if we're looking at things like mindfulness, there's a couple of different psychological approaches that use mindfulness and have a different conceptualization. Now, Buddhism is definitely what works best for me, but that's not to say that other approaches aren't also beneficial. I should also point out that my interest in Buddhism is secular. So it's a non-religious interest. I don't believe in cyclic rebirth, for example. Nonetheless, though, I think Buddhism provides us with a different perspective on the world, and particularly a different perspective in terms of how we approach things that we might find difficult. So in terms of what I'm going to talk about, we're going to have to jump around a bit. Hopefully that will make sense as we go through the presentation. But I'm going to start off trying to pin down compassion and explain what I mean about how important it is that we know what it is we're talking about when we use that term. I'm then going to very briefly take a look at the evidence base with regard to Buddhist-derived interventions within Western psychology. That might seem a little bit dry. But again, I think it's important if you're coming at this from a non-religious angle like I am. You know, actually, I'd heard a lot about mindfulness meditation, and it had never kind of seemed particularly important to me until I kind of came across some of the research and saw that actually that this is very effective. So it might be a kind of hook for some of you. We're then going to take a sort of very brief look at Buddhist philosophy. And again, bear in mind, this is kind of several thousand years worth of history that I'm trying to condense into 45 minutes. So it will be brief. I'll go on to mindfulness shortly, and then hopefully tie everything together by looking at what compassion should be within PBS. So in terms of pinning down compassion, what you can see here is a dictionary definition, essentially. So a strong feeling of sympathy and sadness for other people's suffering or bad luck, and a desire to help. And this is kind of what I'm getting at, because I don't really think that definition is very helpful when we consider our work. You know, sympathy particularly, I don't think is really an appropriate term. I think there's a real risk that that could be considered patronizing or condescending. And particularly when we come to think of groups that have been regularly devalued or othered, such as the autistic community, I don't think that's really what we're getting at. And essentially, if we look at the meaning of compassion within Buddhism, it's distinctly different. So here you've got kind of two really key concepts, both of which have their own associated meditative practices. So first is loving kindness. The Sanskrit is Maitri, and that's the wish for all sentient beings to have happiness and its causes. The second, then, compassion, the Sanskrit is Karuna, and this is the wish for all sentient beings to be free from suffering and its causes. Now, immediately, I think that is much more fit for purpose, and it's a lot more kind of appropriate for a PBS approach, because here we can kind of think of it in terms of what we're wanting to achieve is to support the person to be free from suffering and to be free from the causes of suffering. So in that sense, we can start thinking about things like antecedent control, but more importantly, thinking about progressive development. So fundamentally, it's about supporting the person to progress and develop so that they can become free from things that they find difficult, things that cause them suffering. Again, this is where I'm kind of coming from in terms of it being really important to consider exactly what we mean by compassion. Because when it comes to things like kindness, and choice to an extent, sometimes these things are kind of misunderstood or misused within the areas in which we work. So one example I'd use to kind of justify that, I suppose, is thinking about things like active support type approaches. You know, very regularly when people are implementing active support in the initial stages, you know, some of the barriers that they run up to is things like, you know, the person sits on the TV all day, on their sofa all day with the TV in the background, you know, and that the staff team, when they're asked why isn't this person doing more, you know, they'll say, well, that's their choice, that's what they want to do. Now, I'm not saying that those staff are bad people, and I'm not saying that they're trying to be unkind. In all likelihood, they're actually trying to be kind. You know, they're thinking this is what the person wants. In the meantime, they're running around the house doing all of the cleaning, all of the domestic work, all of the kind of cooking, and basically waiting on the person. Now, if we're just taking a kind approach, that's kind of where we can end up. That the reality is it can be very counterproductive, because what it ends up meaning is that we're denying the person involvement in their own life, and we're not allowing them opportunities to progress and develop. I think we need to go a step further, though, in terms of how we conceptualize compassion. And we're going to do this through looking at the Tibetan practice of Tonglen. So I should probably say that in terms of my personal interest in Buddhism, it is predominantly Tibetan Buddhism that I'm interested in, the Dalai Lama particularly. And he describes this practice of Tonglen, which is essentially compassion meditation. Now, through compassion meditation and Tonglen, which translates essentially as sending and receiving, what the practitioner is aiming to do is to receive the suffering of others and to aim to experience the suffering of others, whilst also sending one's own virtues in return. Now, it's kind of worth mentioning that Buddhism doesn't kind of think that people's suffering can be magically alleviated by this practice. The aim essentially is to develop a more compassionate outlook on the world through understanding other people's suffering. But in terms of making a slight leap, what we can therefore consider compassion to mean, it's rooted in an understanding of the experience of others. So understanding other people's suffering, which we could also consider empathy. Compassion then, that kind of sending element, is about acting in a congruent way. So acting upon an understanding of the other person's experience. And this is where I think that compassion has real utility within our work. So what we should be focusing upon doing is identifying people's experiences and acting upon our understanding of that. That kind of brings us on to Buddhist derived interventions. As I said, this is going to be brief, but I also think it's really, really important. One of the reasons that it's important to go over this, I think, is that a lot of kind of Buddhist concepts have been adopted into Western popular culture, and sometimes the depth of understanding hasn't been there in the slightest, and a lot of these things kind of become throwaway terms. Mindfulness and meditation are both good examples of this. So each are quite kind of commonly spoken about in Western culture. But I'll give an example in terms of my own experience. So, you know, the first time that meditation was explained to me, I was probably 7 or 8 years old. And it was in a school assembly, which was given by the local vicar. And, you know, he basically said meditation is about sort of being calm and tranquil. And said what you do is you clear your mind. And, you know, the moment he said clear your mind, what I envisaged was, for some bizarre reason, a rocking horse with a green and white background. And every time that meditation was mentioned to me for years later, that again is what I kind of saw. The issue is that without kind of properly being able to explain or understand these concepts, we risk kind of reducing them down to the point at which they become useless. So again, in terms of my sort of personal characteristics, this sort of idea that you can be mindful just because someone says clear your mind, it is just completely unrealistic. You know, I'm very over analytical. I think far too much, and you know, there are positives to that. There are also distinct negatives, and it's definitely caused me problems at times. But someone just saying clear your mind, it isn't going to do me the slightest bit of good. And in terms of the evidence base, therefore, there are some criticisms, but it has to be recognised that the popularity of mindfulness and the evidence for its use has been growing over a long period of time. So Buddhist-derived mindfulness interventions have been used since the late 80s and early 90s. There's a meta-analysis which found small to medium effects of mindfulness-based interventions, looking at a variety of variables. There's also been a systematic review of kindness-based meditation, which shows benefits on well-being and social interaction. And then finally, a systematic review of loving kindness meditation and compassion meditation, which identifies that it might have applications in the prevention and treatment of mood disorders, anxiety disorders, stress, and schizophrenia. The kind of key point here is that these things are effective. Now, regarding some of those criticisms, I suppose it's the fact that, you know, these things haven't always been properly defined and operationalized. So, for example, the review of kindness-based meditation just essentially lumped loving kindness and compassion meditation together, when in actual fact they are distinctly different. Similar criticisms can be made about mindfulness. Now, it's not to say that different approaches to mindfulness don't have their merits, because actually when we look at that meta-analysis of mindfulness-based interventions, you know, one of the criticisms that predominantly the evidence was from mindfulness-based stress reduction. Now, therefore, the kind of outcomes of those studies were quite limited in that they were largely focused upon stress, which, you know, again, it does what it says on the tin. It's called mindfulness-based stress reduction. However, looking at mindfulness within Buddhism, it's a much broader concept, and we will kind of come on to that as we start talking through Buddhist philosophy. So this is our starting point. human beings want happiness and do not want suffering. And actually, that really kind of gets to the heart of matters quite early on. This is essentially the Dalai Lama's explanation of all human motivation. And, you know, it does closely mirror a behavioral perspective. You know, we can think about this as referring to positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. So essentially wanting happiness and escaping or avoiding suffering. Fundamentally, though, when the Dalai Lama talks about this, what he's talking about is how we view and approach other people. Essentially, he's saying that we can relate to other people more effectively if our starting point is always looking at sameness rather than looking at the differences between us. And, you know, this is really useful in terms of how we relate to people within our work. So irrespective of whether we're working with the CEO of a large organization or whether we're working with an autistic child, you know, fundamentally, we should be approaching them in the same way, seeing that this is a person who is human, just the same as me. They want happiness and they do not want suffering. Suffering has a very specific role within Buddhism. So the kind of starting point, I suppose, in understanding Buddhist thought is the Four Noble Truths. The first of which is that suffering exists. Now, what we essentially need to do, therefore, is recognize that in the physical world around us, suffering exists and it is essentially unavoidable. And when we're talking about suffering here, we're talking about things like physical pain, the suffering of change. So the suffering of change is essentially that things that we might see as pleasant within Buddhism would be seen to have a true nature of suffering. So a kind of simple example is thinking in terms of, you know, really nice food. We have a really, really big meal and we enjoy it. But fundamentally, if we eat too much, it causes discomfort. If we're kind of watching our weight or whatever, you know, fundamentally, it might seem pleasurable, but actually its true nature is that of suffering. And finally, pervasive conditioning. So pervasive conditioning basically means that we are conditioned to be overly attached to the physical world around us and to kind of misunderstand our place within it. The second noble truth then is the sources of suffering. So essentially this is about understanding that afflictive emotions, so anger, jealousy, stress, none of these things bring us happiness essentially. In themselves, they only cause further suffering. And it's important to kind of understand that what they're saying is that suffering is caused not by the physical world around us per se, but by our emotional responses to it. So if we think about stress as a good example, you know, most of us can kind of relate to feeling stressed. Like say we've got a really important meeting or something and, you know, it clashes with childcare commitments or something, and we know the timing's going to be tight. We can get really, really stressed about that, but it's not actually the kind of physical event itself that's causing that stress. It's actually our emotional response to it, in terms of if we can kind of let go a little and forgive ourselves if we get it wrong, then we cease to suffer. True cessations, therefore, is about understanding the true nature of things, understanding that there is a separation between the physical world and our emotional self, our minds, as it were. And it's only through understanding the first three truths that we can reach the true path. Now, within Buddhism, this is technically the Noble Eightfold Path. We don't have time to go into that level of detail, but for now we can kind of think of it as morality, concentrated meditation, and wisdom. And essentially it is through this that we can genuinely understand the nature of things. This also kind of brings us to an important point about mindfulness, though, because one of the kind of key things about mindfulness and Buddhism is that it doesn't exist as a kind of discrete concept. You know, it doesn't exist in its own right. Mindfulness is both a process, in terms of it's a process to attaining a meditative state, but it's also an outcome. So by engaging in concentrated meditation, we can develop a more mindful outlook on the world. But in terms of kind of, you know, some of the Western conceptualizations of mindfulness, that we're going to do some mindfulness now, that just doesn't exist within Buddhism. And the purpose of that path is about developing wisdom. So there's kind of 4 really key concepts within Buddhist wisdom, and it relates to how we view the world around us and our place within it. There's actually a lot of parallels with acceptance and commitment therapy. You know, psychological flexibility gets a lot of kind of focus within ACT. The Dalai Lama refers to developing a supple mind, and essentially it's very, very similar in terms of this just allows us to kind of break down some of our rigidity in the way that we view things. So the first here is non-attachment, and essentially this is about recognizing that whatever we're kind of thinking about, whether it's objects or items, or whether it's people and relationships, we can never truly possess anything. That there is nothing in this life that we can genuinely possess. Everything is essentially impermanent. So whether we're thinking of ourselves, whether we're thinking of a relationship, or whether we're thinking of our favorite object, fundamentally all of those things are finite. You know, we can't keep them forever. From impermanence, then, we get to emptiness, and emptiness is the idea that the physical world around us lacks inherent existence. So nothing that we encounter inherently exists as one discrete thing. Now that's quite a hard one to get your head around, so I'm going to try and explain it in terms of a simple example. But if we consider a tree, essentially, and let's say our definition of a tree is a stick that stands upright with leaves, you know, you might say, well, it's a tree. It's defined by its treeness. But in terms of it having inherent existence, what we've got to consider, therefore, is how could it be anything else? You know, if it inherently exists, it's always a tree. So if you imagine that this tree gets a fungal infection, and, you know, the fungus starts growing within it, and it eventually kills the tree, well, the stick's still there, essentially, and the leaves might even still be there, although it's dead. And you might just say, well, that's a dead tree. But fundamentally, you know, the fungal mycelium are now running all the way through the wood, so it's no longer just one organism even. Is it still a tree in the same way it was when it was living? If we then say that someone cuts it down, it's now, well, it's still a big stick, but it's no longer upright, and it might still have some leaves, but it's lying down on the floor. And from there, we can go further and say that the person cuts it into planks of wood. Well, it's no longer one stick, it's a big pile of sticks. You know, is it still a tree? And if it's not a tree, then how could it ever have been inherently a tree? Because it's now become something else. Now, in terms of where that takes us, it leads us onto the idea of interconnectedness, because the important thing is Buddhism doesn't deny cause and effect. You know, if I hit the leave chat button on my computer now, the screen goes blank and no one's talking anymore. Fundamentally, you know, I'm not saying that these things don't exist and there is no physical reality. But what we're kind of driving at here is that the principle of interconnectedness tells us that things only exist through coexisting. So the tree only exists in coexistence with the world around it. And that is exactly true of us as well. You know, we don't inherently exist just as single individuals. Again, kind of sticking with the tree example, you know, fundamentally, the tree is photosynthesizing, and as it photosynthesizes, it's taking in carbon dioxide, it's producing oxygen, we then breathe in that same oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide that the tree itself breathes in. And in fact, we only exist in an interconnected way. I'm going to have someone else explain that to you who's cleverer than I am, though, with respect to the self, and particularly how we can kind of create erroneous ideas about what the self is, particularly within the West. So hopefully this will play, and it's Dr. William Van Gordon talking about emptiness and non-self.
People have a tendency to construct a very fixed sense of self, concrete even. And they have a tendency to live out their lives through the lens of me, mine, and I. Now, to a certain degree, it's perfectly natural, necessary even, to continuously relate things back to the self. But when our belief in selfhood becomes deeply ingrained, that can impair our ability to live well and to function well, and it can impact on our mental health. You see, when we investigate the self-construct scientifically, it's actually very difficult to locate or identify something that we can call me, I, or self, that exists separately or independently from everything else that exists. In actual fact, we and all things inter-exist. We inter-exist with everything else around us. In other, there exists self. In self, there exists other. I'm breathing in the out-breath of this plant. It's breathing in my out-breath. And so when we construct beliefs that are not in accord with the rules of nature or the rules of physics, then invariably, sooner or later, that leads to problems, whether for ourselves or for society more generally. And so what we have to do is learn to let go of ourselves a little bit, learn to get over ourselves a little bit, and construct a more dynamic sense of self that's more open to change. When we do that, then we get less caught up in the soap opera of self. We're more able to see and understand ourselves more clearly. And that's a much more relaxing and much more enjoyable way to live our lives.
So I'm going to kind of elaborate on this a bit and then kind of link it in, I suppose, with overall well-being. The first thing I'd say to kind of illustrate that idea of about us being empty of an inherent self, a kind of good way of thinking of this is the different views that people might hold of us. So when I kind of think of me, if I think of like someone that I work with, their view of who I am as a person, but then contrast it with one of my friends' views of who I am as a person, and then how my daughters see Dada and what that means to them, those different people are distinctly different from one another. So if there was this kind of inherent self, this is what Hugh is, fundamentally those views shouldn't differ that drastically. In terms of how this kind of links in with well-being, I'd kind of go to Martin Seligman. Now, in terms of the PERMA model, I'm going to kind of pre-assume that everyone's come across that. But Martin Seligman talks a lot about the rise of the maximal self in terms of explaining why it is that mental health problems such as depression have risen so significantly across the course of the 20th century. At the start of the 20th century, they barely existed. And he kind of talks about this idea that our culture as a whole has become increasingly individualistic since the 1950s and 60s. And actually, I think that one of the outcomes of this is that there's a lot of pressure on people, a lot of pressure in terms of who they are as an individual, who they are as a person. And you can see this a lot on social media in terms of, people kind of trying to be certain things, trying to be the most popular, trying to be the most kind of sociable, or have the most exciting social life, or to be the most attractive or desirable. And actually, you know, a lot of these things can become intense pressures on you've got to do more, achieve more, and be more. And that kind of comes at a cost. So I think that having a kind of healthier concept of self is very beneficial for well-being. And that brings us on to mindfulness. Now, this is one of my real concerns about mindfulness, that it's kind of treated as a discrete process, and often used as quite a kind of throwaway term. It comes back to the idea of, you know, someone says to me, clear your mind. You know, that is not going to work. It's not going to do me any good in the slightest. Now, I haven't really got time to look at the kind of research regarding mindfulness within PBS, but you know, fundamentally there are quite a few studies out there now that have shown that mindfulness is really beneficial to caregivers of people who engage in behaviours of concern. Not only is it effective at reducing stress, but also without any direct intervention, it impacts on outcomes for the people receiving support. So the behaviours of concern decrease purely as a result of that reduction in stress of caregivers. Now, that evidence base is great. And I'm fully on board with mindfulness training for staff in social care. The real problem with that, though, I think, is contextual fit. You know, it's hard enough as it is getting services to kind of free up their staff for one day's PBS training, let alone saying, oh, by the way, I want all of your staff to go on a 4-day mindfulness retreat. It's just not going to happen. But, you know, I think there is a distinct problem if we're going around to staff who've been through some really difficult things, or who are very, very stressed, or, you know, who are regularly working with someone who really hurts themselves, just saying to them, oh, you know, be mindful, you know, that isn't going to help them in the slightest. So we need to be cautious of that. And, you know, again, this kind of comes back to some of the criticisms of mindfulness within Western psychology. So the first point here is that essentially, if we're talking about mindfulness from a Buddhist context, it cannot be divorced from the other factors of the Eightfold Path. You know, Buddhist concepts and practices haven't always been properly understood by the West. The majority of research regarding mindfulness-based interventions has been focused on first-generation mindfulness-based interventions. And this has led to some people using the term mindfulness. In terms of first-generation mindfulness interventions and what that means, we're going to look at two separate definitions of mindfulness. So the first is mindfulness as defined in mindfulness-based stress reduction. The second is mindfulness as defined from a Buddhist perspective within Western psychology. It's really the use of the term non-judgmentally that I take issue with here. You know, how can you be non-judgmental about intrusive thoughts whilst you're trying to be mindful, particularly if they're kind of distressing thoughts? And again, kind of coming back to the work that we do and the areas in which we work, you know, if as I'm trying to be mindful, I'm thinking about seeing someone cause themselves real harm, you know, how am I meant to be non-judgmental about that? The fact of the matter is, the second definition, so the process of engaging a full, direct and active awareness of experience phenomena that is spiritual in aspect and that is maintained from one moment to the next, that is something that I can do. As much as anything, it's understanding that mindfulness is an active and a discriminative state. It is not about just clearing your mind. It is about focusing on the present moment in an active manner. But again, I kind of highlight that I'm not just kind of bad-mouthing mindfulness-based stress reduction here. The evidence base shows that it works. However, my kind of real thought is that looking at mindfulness in its proper context within Buddhism means that people are likely to develop in other ways rather than purely reducing stress. The other point I'd make is that whereas mindfulness, my interest in Buddhism and mindfulness is secular, that's not to say that it's not spiritual. And I think it's important to distinguish between the idea of religion and spirituality. Again, I'd link that back to the PERMA model and Martin Seligman. You know, one of the key elements of that is meaning, you know, developing a sense of meaning in life. And he talks about this as a feeling of being attached to something greater than yourself. And again, that's why I think kind of the spiritual aspect of mindfulness is important. You know, for me, it's got nothing to do with there being kind of supernatural forces within the world, but it is about having a kind of greater sense of connection to people, nature, and the world in which I live. And this is that context within which mindfulness sits, essentially. That kind of brings us on to compassion within PBS. So the first point that I'd make is that when we're thinking about compassion, you know, it's distinctly different from sympathy. You know, when we're not sympathizing immediately, if we're talking about sympathy, it implies that we're kind of looking down on people. What we should be seeking to do is to understand the people that we work with, to understand their experience, and to act in a way that is congruent with that understanding. And the two quotes from Weiss and Knoster and Carr really illustrate that's what PBS is about. Fundamentally, it is about understanding the context, understanding the environment. And if we're doing that properly, it also is important in terms of how we view the person that we support. You know, we're not situating the problem in them. We're situating the problem within a social context. And that's a really important distinction. Finally, the kind of Brian McLean quote, a good functional assessment is an act of empathy. And I think that's really important. It mirrors kind of Lavinia's explanation of functional assessment quite nicely in terms of building a story around people. You know, fundamentally, we're trying to understand people's experiences. And that's why I think it's so important that we're clear about what we mean by compassion when we're talking about the people that we support. And it also comes back to how we relate to them. We relate to them in terms of our sameness. We are all people, and we're not creating those us and them barriers and divides. But we also need to think about compassion in terms of staff and organizational context. And I think this is really important, particularly bearing in mind I said that in terms of mindfulness interventions for staff, massive problem with contextual fit. Well, what am I suggesting then? And you know, the kind of key point here is that if we look at the evidence base regarding exposure to behaviours of concern, so staff supporting people who engage in concerning behaviours, you know, what does that evidence base show us? It shows us overwhelmingly that context is important. Now, I definitely don't have time to go through every one of these in detail, so I'm just going to kind of pick out some key ones. But, you know, the first and second studies basically identify that burnout and stress are higher in institutional settings than in community settings, and that staff, charity staff, view their organisation more positively and experience lower burnout than staff working in institutional settings. The Chung et al. Study, I think, is really important because staff directly identified that burnout was more related to management issues than it was to the people that they support. You know, if we kind of go through the research in totality, what it shows us is that the social context is really important. So feeling supported by your staff team, feeling supported by your organisation is really important in determining whether staff develop kind of psychological responses such as stress and burnout. But the fact of the matter is those things are not determined by the severity of the behaviour of concern of the person that they're supporting. And so in terms of compassion towards staff and compassionate organisations, firstly, the aim and the mission of the organisation is really important. More important than that is congruence with it. fundamentally, do we actually kind of uphold the values that we are espousing? And, I can really relate to this in terms of, in workplaces in the past, as soon as people become aware that fundamentally the aim of the organization is to make money, that is toxic for culture, and it's bad for staff well-being. We need to be kind of keeping the focus on the people receiving support, and that doesn't have to be at the entire organization level. That can be at the service level. It can be about your individual service and making it sure that the values within that service are focused upon. We want good quality outcomes for the people we're working with, but that actually does have benefits in terms of staff well-being. Appreciating and valuing staff is vital. Fundamentally showing that we recognize their contributions. That's something that comes up in the literature over and over again. And I suppose in terms of mindfulness and where that sits, I'd be looking at working conditions. Because actually, in terms of talking about whether or not mindfulness is an appropriate intervention for social care staff, we need to take a step back and say, do those staff actually get a break at all? Because regularly, the places that I'm working in, I'm not convinced they do, or at least not easily, regularly. So rather than kind of get into the more complex intervention in terms of teaching them meditation, the kind of first thing is, do they get 5 minutes to themselves where they're outside, where they're not directly responsible for a vulnerable person? Because fundamentally, if we're saying that mindfulness is about kind of present moment awareness, that's what I'd be focusing on. Like, let's not complicate it with mindfulness. Let's just say they get 5 minutes to themselves. And, I think this is particularly important for staff who don't smoke. Smokers tend to get those 5-minute breaks. Often non-smokers don't. And so particularly managers in services kind of doing those little checks on their staff and just thinking, do they get 5 minutes away every day, and consciously making the effort to ensure that actually, the sector as a whole is massively understaffed. We might not be able to do everything perfectly, but we probably can check in on people and just say, do you want 5 minutes outside? Final point then, staff support shouldn't be only focused on debriefing. Debriefing, yeah, I'm not saying it's not important, but it gets so much focus now. And again, what the literature tells us is that it's not all about post-incident support. The literature tells us it's the context within which exposure to behaviour of concern occurs. And a lot of this is simple stuff, supervisory support. Being able to talk to someone when you're finding your work difficult makes a massive difference. If you're having personal problems outside of work, being able to talk to someone about that is also very, very important. The personal relationships that staff have within their working environment are also important. Social support, feeling part of a team, and having shared values and culture. So yes, it's important that we have kind of debriefing in place, but fundamentally we need to look at that as something that we're building up to if we haven't got those kind of basic social supports in place first. And that kind of brings us to a final thought, I suppose. I haven't left much time for questions. I didn't think I would. And that's why my email.
15 minutes, you're okay.
Perfect, good stuff, pleased to hear it. But that's why my email address is there. If there is kind of questions that we don't get round to today, please do feel free to pop me an email. I'm more than happy to try and explain some more. But I think the kind of really key message from me is that when we're kind of using a term like compassion, we have to think very carefully what we mean by it. It has to be about acting upon an understanding of the other person's experience. And I think within PBS, that's vital. That's what it needs to be about. It needs to be about seeking to understand the people we're supporting, and helping them in a manner that is congruent with that. It's not about changing people or fixing people, because immediately then we're kind of situating the problem with them. It comes back to that idea that it's all about context.
Thank you, Hugh. That's fantastic. If anyone's got any questions, just pop them in the chat box and we should both be able to see them. I say should. how things are moving. I've lost my chat box. I think for me, it was about tying it in with the contextual fit. I think that ties in so nicely. As you know, we talk about mindfulness a lot. It's being thrown around a lot, and actually thinking about how that really relates and actual what that means as well. It's become a bit of a, I like the myth mindfulness because it's become another buzzword.
Yeah, and I think it is that, don't get me wrong, individual here. Some people, their kind of thinking styles, their cognitive styles will respond well to that kind of, here's a nice sunset, have a look at that and be in the present moment. You know, for some people that works, but you shouldn't assume that that will work for a lot of people, because fundamentally it won't. It took me years to properly understand mindfulness and how to achieve something remotely like a mindful state. And again, I suppose that kind of takes us back to the idea that within Buddhism is part of the Noble Eightfold Path. Well, the expectation is that that path takes many, many years to achieve. And even the Dalai Lama talks about it in terms of, well, he's not actually saying he's there. You know, this is a process rather than an end kind of final outcome. So if we do want to kind of encourage staff to be mindful, you know, I'm not saying that it's an all or nothing approach, but we've got to think about actually how we explain it to them and looking at it as a developmental thing. So something that we talk about on a regular basis and kind of give them actual kind of techniques and explanation of this is how you go about doing it, rather than just saying, go off and be mindful.
I think that ties in really nicely to Beverly's question. As a wellbeing champion, where do we start with introducing within our colleagues and introducing the philosophy?
Okay. Well, first off, I guess you've got to kind of think about whether or not you should, because again, that kind of comes back to what I was saying in terms of, I'm not saying Buddhism is best. You know, what is it that you want to achieve? Because actually, you know, there's a conceptualization of mindfulness within acceptance and commitment therapy. There is mindfulness-based stress reduction. And I'm not saying that none of those things have something to offer, because they definitely do. They've both got a really strong evidence base. But I guess in terms of what Sam and I were just talking about, it's looking at what you want to achieve for your staff. So if you're kind of thinking more about, we're looking at how we can kind of get staff using sort of maybe some mindfulness techniques as a means of maybe kind of reducing stress, then I'd keep it simple. What I'd also do though is come back to some of those basics in terms of, you know, are they getting those kind of regular breaks and stuff? You know, is mindfulness overcomplicating things? And actually, do we need to kind of think more about the mechanics of how we ensure that everyone gets a 5 or 10 minute break every day? But also looking at things like kind of culture and supervisory support, I'd say should take precedence to kind of introducing mindfulness. If you were going to kind of introduce mindfulness and these types of concepts, then really I'd be thinking about, well, what resources do you have? Do you have kind of the opportunity to do actual kind of training in this? Or is it more something that we're going to start kind of introducing to team meetings, for example? If it's more the kind of team meetings type approach, you know, there's lots and lots of resources out there. So the video that I showed was from someone called William Van Gordon. He has a really lovely dual perspective in that he is a research psychologist and a Buddhist monk. He has his own website. He works for the University of Derby, but actually he's got a whole series of videos which you can access just to kind of have a simple plain English explanation of some of these concepts. So things like that can be quite helpful. But as I said, the kind of key message, I suppose, is that I'd always look at the kind of simple things first, because I do think we have a tendency to go to more complex strategies without getting the basics right first, whether we're talking about the people we support or whether we're talking about staff. And as I said, with staff, look at that literature. What does it say to us? It says staff who can have a chat with their supervisor when they're having a difficult time do a lot better than staff who feel that they can't. You know, and until we get those things right, I don't necessarily think we should overcomplicate the situation.
I think, yeah, I think there's been a few more questions kind of followed on from that as well. So we've, in terms of applying mindfulness with regards to goal setting for clients, how do you counteract the notion of some organisations that means independence means a drop of funding and therefore there's little motivation to try? So I think this links back to your very early points around kind of people's approaches to different, you know, when we talk about active support and encouraging someone to not watch the TV, actually that independence, we're all, you know, some of our teams are almost punished for promoting that independence at times.
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts. The first one is about recording and basically just making sure that you're accumulating the evidence that's needed to properly show why the person's gained more independence, but why they might still require quite a high level of input from staff. So particularly with respect to active support, that's important in terms of, you know, thinking of like the concept of graded assistance to ensure success. Recording always tends to be important when it comes to these types of issues. And I know exactly what you're talking about because I've been in that situation with local authorities before. You know, we've made all of this progress with the person, teaching them to make choices and to communicate. And the first thing that the social worker says is, right, so they're going down from 2 to 1 then. But so alongside that, in terms of making sure you have the evidence to show, well, this is how we've helped the person to progress. So this is why that level of support was needed, and this is why it's still needed. But the kind of way that I'd counterbalance that is that we shouldn't stop doing good things just because of the macro environment in which we operate. And I suppose this kind of comes back to that idea of the kind of separation within Buddhism between our emotional responses to things and the physical reality in which we live. Because that key principle, suffering exists. Those sorts of macro level decisions, that the political environment, it's not going anywhere. You know, local authorities are never going to want to throw lots of money at our sector. So the reality is it kind of comes back to taking quite a pragmatic view of things like that and thinking, well, fundamentally, we're not doing these things for the person because we want the funding. We're doing them for the person because it's the right thing to do. Because actually we are taking that compassionate outlook. We are trying to understand the person and their needs and trying to help them progress past that point of suffering. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's not frustrating, and I'm not saying that, you know, you shouldn't be worried about those things, because it's the reality of the sector in which we work, and it's not fair. But fundamentally, you know, I try and look at it as we're supporting the person this way because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, for supporting teams, that's about kind of working with their values and motivation. I'd say I don't know many people that have come into support work for the money around it. So actually, you know, it's about supporting those values that people have joined organisations for as well. And that you know, that's one of the core values, is about building someone's independence. Alexandra's used the Q&A box, which I didn't realise was there. Please, could you expand on what's a healthier sense of self?
Okay, so it really comes back to that idea of non-attachment and emptiness. Now, it's going to be difficult within the time that we have to explain that, but if we have a very concrete self-concept, you know, if we see ourselves as I am, so if I relate it back to myself, you know, no matter what I achieve and do, certainly historically, it's never something that I've been proud of or felt that there was anything to be proud of at all. We're not going to go into the kind of reasons behind why that is, but, you know, like I'd be aspiring to a new job, for example, and then I'd actually get it, and I wouldn't feel proud. I just feel, well, that's what's expected. Similarly with qualifications and study, you know, I'm working towards this long-term goal. I actually make it there finally and get whatever qualification it is, and then just think, well, everyone else has got it, and you know, what's the big deal? There's nothing to be proud of there. In many respects, that's because I had quite a kind of concrete, rigid self-concept in terms of I should be doing these things, I should be achieving, and all of these kind of external pressures that aren't really about me per se, they're about my kind of thinking of how other people think about me. You know, in reality, this becomes very concrete then in terms of I have to fulfill certain roles, there are certain things that I have to do, and that in some respects is really quite unhealthy, because what we end up doing is placing real pressures on us, and when the physical world around us changes, which it does, it's impermanent, something unexpected happens, it is very hard then to adapt, because if it's incongruent with that self-view of this is what I have to be. Whereas if we have a much more kind of fluid sense of self, a slightly more kind of detached sense of self, then it becomes more dynamic, and it means that kind of adapting and changing, you know, it's not causing such an internal conflict. As I said, we could talk about that for a long time, so I hope that briefly answered your question, but I don't think I can really do it justice in the remaining time we have available.
I think that's kind of expanded for me personally as well, so thank you. Sandra said thank you. We've probably got time for one more question if anyone else has got any other questions. I think that's there's quite a few thank yous and for you in the chat box as well, Hugh, but I think that's probably all the questions. Oh, right. Hang on, Jenny snuck one. We talk about the sense of self, or I as ego, self-awareness, and in terms of Maslow, the self-actualization. Oh, it's not a question. Just read it and then realize it's not a question. And ensuring all the basic needs are met.
Okay. I like Maslow, and I like that kind of conceptualization of people's needs. I suppose where I'd kind of create a slight distinction is in terms of what self-actualization is. So within Buddhism, it would more be about developing a proper understanding of the world around us and our kind of place within it. There's a really, really beautiful quote that I wanted to include, but I just didn't have time, from Van Gordon and Shonin, which talks about the self in the sense of most people think of themselves as being a wave on an ocean. And as the wave grows, it gets more and more of a sense of self and its own importance. And it's so focused on continuing to grow and being the most important thing. But what happens eventually is that wave crashes down and all of its hopes are dashed. But fundamentally, if it kind of stepped out of itself for a moment and thought, I'm not the wave, I am part of the entire ocean and I'm connected to everything. You know, that's a much healthier way of being. And so self-actualization, I think it's a good thing, but it depends what it means to people, because again, it can become a real pressure in terms of to be at the very peak. I've got to be doing all of these things, whereas in reality, what it should be is about having a good overall well-being, you know, being at ease with oneself and understanding one's true kind of place in the world.
Thank you. And I think Louise has put, it's a wonderful thought-provoking start to the day, and I think it's really set the scene for the rest of the day as well. And I think all of the other talks will link really nicely into the concepts that you've talked about as well.
Great stuff. Well, thank you very much for attending, guys.